Good morning. So let's get started. Yeah, are there any questions about what we were discussing in the last class? So mainly we have seen how to construct a register, then how to perform the read and write operations on a register, then how to put several such registers in the form of a register file, and then carry out the read and write operations. And the typical register files in the processors nowadays will have multiple read ports and one write port typically, and if the complexity of the logic can be afforded, then one can have even more than one write port. Okay, but it requires much more complex logic than a single write port, whereas having multiple read ports is not a problem because we have to just duplicate the structure for each of the read ports. Okay, there is a small correction that we have to add to the write port. So the decoder will have an enable line, and that enable line will be controlled by the write signal, so that these outputs of decoder will be active only when the write signal is active. When the write signal is not active, all the outputs of decoder will be 0, so that none of the registers will have the control lines active. Okay. Yesterday we forgot to mention that, right? That's where the write signal comes to the picture here. Okay. So please make a note of that. And yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any questions about that? Okay. So what you have looked at is a simple memory structure, right, where we can store the data and read the data from one of the registers. But this forms a very important component because this register file will be on the processor very close to the arithmetic and logic unit. And as we'll be seeing a little later in this class today, typically the operands for the ALU operations will come from the registers, and the output generated by the ALU will also typically go first into the registers and then go into what is called the memory unit, right? So the register files play a very important role in the design of the CPU. And as you'll be studying in the next course, when you talk about what are called the process nowadays, which are the multi-threaded process and the multi-core process, there will be several such register files depending on the number of threads to be executed simultaneously and the number of programs that can be executed by the multiple cores of the processor, right? So the register files are going to be very commonly used in the current day process, and the number of registers varies from one processor to another processor, but typically it will be 32 registers, and each register will be 32-bit wide in a 32-bit processor. If it's a 64-bit processor, it may be 64-bit wide. And also typically most of the current day processors will have two register files. One is what is known as the general purpose register file, which are referred to as this R0, R1, and so on. And there may be a separate set of register file, or there may be a separate register file for the floating point unit, and that will be called as the floating point register file. Okay. I'm just leaving a note there, right? When you go through the next course, right, you will study more about that, right? Because the ALU which performs the integer operations will take the operands from this general purpose register file registers, whereas the floating point unit will take the operands from the floating point register file. Okay. Yeah. Are there any questions? Okay. So let's continue the discussion. And at the end of the last class, I was mentioning about some special purpose registers, right? One is what is called the instruction pointer or the program counter, which stores the address of the next instruction to be executed. And this register has to be incremented after every instruction is fetched. Okay. Whereas the stack pointer is used to refer to the address of the top of the stack, and typical operations that involve using the stack or the push and pop. We'll come back to the details maybe in the class tomorrow. Okay. And in order to implement this push and pop operations, one needs the support to either increment the content of the stack pointer or decrement the content of the stack pointer, right? So typically the stack pointer will be having the mechanism to not only store the data and read the data from that, there's also a mechanism to support the increment operation and the decrement operation. So it will act more like a counter, right? And one can perform up count operation or the down count operation like what we have seen in the counter design earlier, right? But here you need only increment or decrement by 1. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now let's go into the discussion on a more generic, what is called a memory unit. And as we'll be seeing little later, typically the program that needs to be executed, which will be in the form of the .exe file on the secondary storage device like a hard disk, will be loaded into the memory unit, which will be referred to as the main memory as we go along. And the program, the executable version of the program, will be placed in the memory unit, and along with the code of the program for which the machine code is generated and stored in the exe file, the data that's going to be processed by that program will also be available in the memory unit, right? And that's why most of the computers that we are dealing with are set to be based on what is called the stored program concept. That is, we store the program and the data together in the memory unit, and then we access the instructions corresponding to the program. We'll come back to what we mean by instructions quickly, right? And also the data that needs to be processed from the memory, and then we do the processing and then store the results back in the memory, right? And because we are storing the program and data together, this is referred to as the stored program concept. And the architectures based on this are named after the famous computer scientist von Neumann, and typically the computers based on this principle are referred to what is called the von Neumann architectures. So let's try to understand the functionality of the memory unit at a high level, then we'll look into the implementation details. So whenever we say there is a memory unit, the purpose of the memory unit is to store either the instructions or the data of a program, and then read them whenever it is required. So basically, it's a storage space, and we need to perform the basic operations like the read operation or the write operation on this memory unit, right? And the specification of the memory unit will be typically given as a 2 power k by n bit memory, where 2 power k indicates the number of memory locations and the n indicates the number of bits that can be stored at each memory location. Let's say we take the value of k as 10, right? Then we are talking about 2 power 10. And if n is 8, then we're talking about 2 power 10 by 8-bit memory. That is, there are 1 k in the computer system, as you know that, right? 2 power 10 is referred to as 1k, right? And the memory unit storage capacity is 1k bytes, right? Typically, it's referred to as 1 kilobyte, right? Or it is actually 2 power 10 bytes. It's not actually 10 power 3, it is 2 power 10. If k is 20 and n equal to 8 itself, all right, then we are talking about 2 power 20 bytes, and the number of memory locations is 2 power 20, right? And typically it is referred to as 1m, right? And as we go for larger value of k, we get more storage space, right? And this k equal to 30 gives us 2 power 30 bytes, right? Which is referred to as the 1 gigabyte, right? But n need not be 8, right? In most of the processors nowadays, n will be either 32 or 64, typically because we want to access not just 1 byte in one read or write operation, right? We typically want to access multiple bytes. Typically, this is what is referred to as the word size of the processor, right? So the word size will be either 32 bits or 64 bits. So if n equal to 32, right, then if k equal to 30, right, then we are talking about 2 power 30 words, right? And each word is 4 bytes, right? So the capacity of this is 2 power 32 bytes, right? So it is 4 gigabytes, right? And in many of the current day processors, they support up to 4 gigabytes. Some later processors may support even more than 4 gigabytes. According to the k value has to be high. Okay. So for any generic memory unit of specification 2 power k by n bit, if we have to perform the read and write operations on this, right, we need to have the storage elements here, and the basic storage element is referred to as the memory cell, where each cell can store 1 bit of data, right? So basically, each cell is referred to as a 1 bit memory element, right? So if you're talking about a 2 power k by n bit memory, there'll be 2 power k memory locations, and in each location there'll be n memory cells, right? So total number of memory cells that are required is the 2 power k by n. We'll be quickly looking at what is the memory cell we are referring to. Irrespective of what is the form of the memory cell, the operations that need to be performed on the memory unit are basically the read and write operations. And how do we access the content of a memory location? Either to perform the read or write operation, right? So like what you have done in the case of the register file, we have to give what is called the address of the location where you want to perform the read or write operation. So typically this is referred to as the memory address. And because we have 2 power k memory locations, right, the number of bits that specify the memory address is k. Then you want to specify whether you want to perform a read operation or you want to perform the write operation. Whenever you want to perform any of these operations, right, you make that signal active, that is, you set that bit to 1, right? Then the corresponding operation will be carried out in the memory unit. And whenever you are performing write operation, you have to provide the data, right? And that data bus will also be n bits wide, right? So whenever you want to perform a write operation, you specify the memory address, which is k bits. Then you specify the n bits that need to be returned to that memory location. Then you enable this write signal. Then the write operation will be carried out. Basically, that data will be stored in that memory location. And whenever you say read operation, in addition to the memory address and the read control signal being active, right? I mean, to perform the read operation, you have to give the memory address and then enable the read signal. Then you'll get the data from the memory, right? Which will be again n bits. This is called the data out. All right. So the functionality wise is similar to the register file. There also we've seen that we give the register address, right? Then we have the read and write control signals. Then we have the data in into the register file. Then we have the data out of the register file. But only question that we have to think about now is the logic that's required to implement the memory unit. Can it be same as the logic that was used in the design of the register file? Okay. And what was the memory cell in the case of the register file? It is a D flip-flop, right? As we'll be seeing later, right? D flip-flop is very complex to build the memory units of very large size. So we'll go for a simpler cell, right? And that will be just adequate enough to perform the basic storage operations like the read and write operations. Okay, we'll come back to that quickly. But more importantly, if I have to build the memory unit on the same lines of the register file, right? What is it we have in the register file? We have the read port and the write port. And what is it we have in the read port and the write port? We have the multiplexer and the demultiplexer and then the decoder, right? So what will be the sizes of these multiplexers and the demultiplexers and the decoders if I have to build this memory unit on the same lines of the register file? Yeah. So here we specified the configuration of the register file as M registers and the each register of N bits, right? So in order to build the register file, what did we do? We let's say we had M equal to 8 here. We have seen that we have used an 8 to 1 mux for the read port, right? And we have used 1 to 8 demux for the write port. If I extend that to the memory unit, I need a multiplexer which is of size 2 power k to 1, right? And the demultiplexer 1 to 2 power k. If k is going to be 20 or 30, what will be the specification of multiplexer? It will be 2 power 10 to 1 and 1 to 2 power 10 in the case of k equal to 10, right? If it is 20, right, it's 2 power 20 to 1 and 1 to 2 power 20. What is it we are talking about? We are talking about multiplexers and demultiplexers having to deal with sources or the destinations of the order of millions, right? And the data length or the data width is n bits. If n is going to be 32 bits, right? These multiplexers and demultiplexers will be of a huge complexity, right? So we cannot afford to build the memory unit in the same way as the register file, right? We need a much simpler mechanism, right? Because otherwise the memory unit logic will be dominated more by this multiplexer and demultiplexer logic than the memory cells themselves, right? So we cannot afford to spare so much of logic in the multiplexer and the demultiplexer, actually the decoder also, right? To build the memory in the same lines of the register file. Okay. So typically what is done is we'll not have the multiplexer and the demultiplexers, but we'll manage with the simple decoders. Let's just look at a simple structure where k equal to 3 and n equal to 4. Let's say these are the rows of memory cells. So I'll just indicate each of them by MC. Right? How many such cells are there? 4 cells in each row, and this is row 0, this is row 1, and row 7. Right? And here it is 0, 1, 2, and 3. So this gives us 2 power 3 by 4 bit memory unit. Okay. Yeah. So whenever we want to perform the read operation or the write operation on this memory cell, we need to select the cells in the particular row, right? So there will be a select line for each of the rows. And only when the select line is active, one can perform either the read operation or the write operation on this row, right? So let's call this as S0, S1, and so on, S7, right? S stands for the select. So how do we enable this select lines? Basically, now we need a decoder, right? In this case, it is 3 to 8 line decoder, right? And it will have 8 output lines which correspond to the select lines, right? And the input to this will be the address, which will be 3 lines. Okay. Now, how does this memory cell function? Only when the select line is active, it can perform the read or write operation. And whenever the read has to be carried out, right, we have to access the contents of this memory cell. So basically, the outputs of this memory cell will be joined together We'll study this more in detail in the next course. I just want to give some brief description of this for the purpose of the discussion that we are going to have in this course. Right? So what are we saying now? Whenever you want to perform a read operation on the, let's say, the row 0, right? Then only this S0 will be active and all other select lines will be inactive, right? And the outputs of each of these cells are connected to what are called these data lines, right? And only the selected cells can make the data in that cell available on this data lines. So if row 0 is selected, only the cells in that row can have their outputs available on the corresponding data lines. Then the outputs of all other cells in the memory unit will be electrically disconnected from the data lines. Okay. So this is what is done in order to perform the read operation. Okay. And when you want to perform the write operation, what has to be done? We'll have similar data lines, right? I'll make it simpler for the discussion in this course that this will be a bidirectional line. Physically, it will be 2 lines, right? One for the input and one for the output. So if it is the write operation, again, we'll make the data available on this D0 to D3 that needs to be written into, and then we'll give the address where that memory operation has to be, write operation has to be carried out, right? And then the row where we want to perform the write operation will have the select line active. Then the memory cells will be able to perform the write operation. So they'll take the data from the data lines and then put the data in the corresponding cells. Okay. So basically, we see that we don't use a multiplexer or the demultiplexer in the design of this memory unit, right? What we use is only a decoder, but still we need a huge size decoder. Let's say if k equal to 30, right? Then we require a decoder with 32 to power 30 lines. Basically, you're talking about a decoder with as many as 1 billion lines coming out of the decoder, right? Which is very complex. I'm not going to details of how to reduce the complexity of the decoder. There are methods to reduce the complexity of the decoder, right? That will be discussed in the next semester course. Okay, but typically this is how the memory unit will be constructed, right? And the read operations and the write operations will be controlled by the read and write lines. So basically, the write operation will be carried out only when the write signal is active, and the read operation will be carried out only when the read signal is active. Okay. What I have not discussed so far is what is the structure of this memory cell, right? And what we'll be seeing is that it will not be same as the flip-flop, because typically the flip-flop, as we have seen, what is the typical structure of the flip-flop. It has got 2 NOR gates and the 2 AND gates, and each of these gates require 3 to 4 transistors. I'm sure all of you would have studied about what are called the transistor elements in the basic electronics course, right? So if you want to go for the conventional structure of the memory cell in the form of a D flip-flop, it requires of the order of about anywhere from 12 to 16 transistors per cell, right? And when we want to build the memory units of very large size of the order of a few gigabytes, right, then the number of transistors that will be required is enormous, right? So typically we don't go for the same structure of the flip-flop in the memory cells. We'll have a much simpler structure, right? That structure depends on the 2 types of memory cells. Again, I'm only giving the names here, but you'll be studying more that in the next course. There are 2 types of memory cells. One is what is called the static RAM cell, where this RAM stands for the random access memory. Actually, all the memory units we design are what are called the random access memories. Because why is it called the random access memory? The time taken to access any randomly selected memory location, right, is the same, right? Whether you're accessing the first memory location or 10th memory location or 1000th memory location or 1 millionth memory location, the time taken to perform the read operation, the write operation is independent of which memory location we are accessing, right? That's why it's called the random access memory. And there are what are called the sequential access memories, which are not used anymore in the current systems, where the time taken to perform the memory access, that is the read or write operation, will be dependent on in which location we are performing the operation, right? And the memory units that we typically come across in the current day systems are all random access memories, and they are shortly called as the RAM. And there are 2 types of memory cells. One is what is called the static RAM cell, which is a cell that is built using 6 transistors. Again, I'm not going into the details. And typically this is used in what is called building the cache memory units. Again, we are not going to discuss this in this course. You will be studying in great length about what are called the fast memory units, which are called as the cache memory unit. And typically there will be multiple levels of cache memory in a memory unit in the current day systems. And typically the sizes of these cache memory units will be of the order of a few kilobytes to few megabytes. Whereas what is typically known as the main memory unit in the computer system is built using a dynamic RAM cell, right, which is used or which is built using only 2 transistors per cell. Actually, 1 transistor is used for the select operation. Whenever the select line is active, that memory cell has to be accessed, right? So there will be 1 transistor which will be used for that. Then there will be 1 transistor where the data is stored, right, as a capacitor. So the data will be stored as a charge on the capacitor, where the transistor itself will be used as a capacitor. The reason why it's called dynamic RAM cell is that the guarantee of the data on the cell is not guaranteed unless it is refreshed periodically, right? Because as all of you know, right, capacitors that we have are not necessarily ideal capacitors. Only the ideal capacitors can retain the charge for an indefinite amount of time, but any non-ideal capacitors will have some leakage, and the charge that's stored on the capacitor will leak. And if you don't do what is called a refresh operation on the capacitor, then the charge will be going down to 0 level, right? Then the data that is stored will be lost. Typically, the information stored as 1 bit will be, the bit 1 will be stored as a full charge on the capacitor, then bit 0 is stored as the no charge on the capacitor. So if the capacitor is not refreshed, that is the recharge periodically, right, then the all the cells where the bit 1 are stored may change to bit 0. That cannot be afforded, right? So we have to recharge the capacitor periodically. Again, we are going to discuss that in more detail. And because the data is not staying there in the cells, right? This is what is referred to as the dynamic RAM cell. Whereas that problem is not there in the static RAM cell, because the whole of this static RAM cell is built using only the transistors, right? And there is no phenomena called the leakage of the information, or the disappearance of the information in the memory cell, right? Again, we'll be discussing more of this in the next level course, right? But irrespective of whether I'm using the static RAM cell or the dynamic RAM cell, the structure of this internal structure of the memory unit will be typically the same as what we have discussed. Actually, what I said is for a memory chip, right? Because it's not possible to build the whole memory unit of the capacity of 4 gigabytes using a single memory chip, because the decoder size is going to be very, very complex. So typically, the memory chips will be of the order of, in the current day scenario, it will be about maybe 128 M by 4 bits. So typical memory chips will be, I'm talking about DRAM memory chips. Right? What is 128 M? It's a 2 power 7 into 2 power 20, right? That is 2 power 27. Right? So if you have one chip with the 2 power 27 memory locations, where each location can store 4 bits, right? This gives you so much of memory. Then you have 8 such memory chips in single row. I'm talking now about in a row of chips, or it's also referred to as a bank, right? So what will be the capacity of this? 2 power 27 by 32 bits, right? That will give you 128 M multiplied by 4 bytes, right? That will be 512 megabytes, right? So 8 memory chips in a row of chips, which is called as a bank, where each memory chip is of the capacity of 128 M by 4 bits, right? Can give you a storage space of 512 megabytes. So if you want to have a total memory unit of capacity 2 GB, right? Then you'll have 4 such banks, right? Where each bank is of capacity 512 MB, right? I mean, that's what you see whenever you see what is called a RAM board. When you open a computer system, right? There'll be number of chips, and there'll be the number of rows of such chips, right? And all of that is what is called as a main memory card, or a RAM board, okay? And if you want to have 4 GB, right, then you have to have 8 memory banks, or you should have go for a largest capacity memory chip, okay? Typically, the static RAM memory will be of the order of a few kilobytes of space, or it may be a few megabytes of space, but not as large as gigabytes as in the DRAM memory, which is typically used to build the what is known as the main memory unit. And loosely, this is the capacity of this main memory unit is what is called as the RAM size. Whenever you see the computer specifications, typically they specify what is called the RAM size. What they are referring to is actually the capacity of the main memory unit. Okay. So basically, I want you to get some basic idea about what is this memory unit, all right, and how do you perform the operations like the read or write operations into the memory unit. There are many more details that need to be looked into, right, and that will be considered, or that will be discussed in the next course. Okay, yeah, are there any questions about this? Yeah. Okay. So now we'll go into the next topic in the course, right, where we want to understand how a typical higher level language program will be represented in the form of the machine code, or which are called the machine level instructions, and then how this sequence of machine level instructions that corresponds to the executable code of a higher level language program will be executed on a typical processor or a typical computer system, right? So what will be there in the typical computer system? So first let's look into what will be there in a typical CPU. The CPU will consist of ALU. And what is ALU itself? Typically the ALU will consist of two parts, the integer unit and the floating point unit. So this is what the ALU consists of, and what are the operations that it can do? Typically it will perform the arithmetic operations on the integer type data, arithmetic operations on the floating point data, and also the logical operations, right? And even the compare operations and so on. Okay. And typically there will be register files. Okay. And in addition to this ALU and register files, right, we have seen the function of both the ALU and the register file. There will be a unit called the control unit, which will coordinate the sequence of operations that need to be carried out in the execution of a program on the CPU, right? And all these three units put together is what is referred to as the central processing unit, or typically we simply refer to it as the processor, right? So basically the purpose of this register file will be temporarily store the data corresponding to the operands, and also to store the intermediate results. And we'll be seeing that with some examples, right? So the contents of these registers will be taken and then passed on to the ALU. Then the ALU will perform the necessary operations. Then it will put the results back in the register file, right? So which operation has to be carried out will be specified by the control unit. And where is the control unit going to get that information? It has to get the information about that from the instructions that represent the given program. Again, we'll come back to that quickly, right? But originally the data will be available, or the program will be available in the memory unit. So both the program and the data will be available in the memory unit. So we have to get the instructions corresponding to the program one by one, and then perform the execution of those instructions within the CPU. And we may store back the results in the memory unit. And in order to get the operand data from the memory unit, we have to perform the memory unit read operations. And whenever you want to write back the results into the memory unit, we perform the write operations on the memory unit. And also typically there will be some input output devices. And the typical input output devices we have minimally in a computer system are the keyboard, then the display, right? And of course the secondary storage device like a hard disk. Okay, we'll come back to that maybe at a later point, right? So all of this put together, right, is what is referred to as a computer system, right? Of course, what we are showing is only the physical structure of the computer system, right? Basically, this is what is referred to as the hardware component of the computer system, right? Obviously, there is a lot more to the computer system than the physical hardware, right? Which is in the form of the software. The software includes components like the operating system, then the compilers, and so on. All right. So you're going to get some idea about the important components of the system software, right? Referring to the operating systems and the compilers and a few other things as we go along, right? And all of that, along with the physical structure as part of the computer system, which is referred to as the CPU, memory unit, and the I/O devices, is what is referred to as the computer system. So what we are trying to do in this course is to get an idea about how to design a computer system. We are looking at some of the foundational aspects of the design of the computer system. Okay, so we'll come back to the details of the internal organization of the computer and the internal organizations of the CPU as we go along in the rest of the course. Yeah, any questions at this point? Okay, so now let's just go on to the next topic in the course. Yeah, how do we process a high-level language program and then represent that in the form of what are called the machine level instructions? Whenever we are referring to the machine level instructions, these are the instructions that can be executed by a particular processor. And when we represent this machine level instructions in the binary form, then that's referred to as the machine code. So we'll try to understand how to generate this machine code, and then of course how to execute this machine code. Okay, and you must be aware that typically the machine code generation is done for the higher level language programs by software called the compiler, right, which typically takes a higher level language program, like a program in C, right, then it generates what is called the machine code, and machine code will be completely in the binary form, right, and that will correspond to the sequence of instructions that represents the higher level language program. And only thing is, this sequence of machine level instructions will be dependent on the particular processor on which the program is going to run. Okay, and there are variety of processors, like you are familiar with the Intel processors, ARM processors, and so on. All right, I mean basically the different companies, right, manufacture different types of processors, and each of these processors will have a different architecture and a different what is called the instruction set architectures, right. Therefore, the machine code that's generated for each of the processors will be different, even though you are compiling the same high-level language program. What it basically implies is that the compilers will be different for the different processors, and in order to simplify the machine code generation process, as we'll be seeing later in the course, right, we go for the usage of what is called as the virtual machine, right, which will kind of make it easy to simplify this process of generation of the machine code from the higher level language program. Okay, again, as we go along, we'll see some details of that. Okay, so first we'll try to understand with some simple examples what is it involved in generation of this machine code from the higher level language programs. What are the typical statements in the higher level language programs? All of you are familiar with some higher level language program, right? Because you've gone through the relevant courses, and you're also going through some courses now. Okay, so you're familiar with the many types of higher level language programs. Okay, and I'm sure all of you have gone through the C program coding. Okay, so I'll take some simple examples from the C program language, right, and then we'll try to understand how the statements in a typical high level language program can be converted into the sequence of machine level instructions. So let's look at a very simple arithmetic statement in a high level language of, let's say, an arithmetic statement where we have some variables A, B, C, and D. Then I want to perform the arithmetic operations on the values of these variables and then store the result into the variable E, right? So this is basically assignment statement, where the right hand side of the assignment statement is an arithmetic statement, right? And we want to perform the addition and subtraction operations. Actually, we have to declare the data types of these variables and then carry out these operations. We'll not worry about that part for the time being. Okay, yeah. So this is a higher level language arithmetic statement. How does it get converted into a sequence of machine level instructions? So the typical machine level instructions are the instructions that correspond to the operations that can be carried out by the ALU. What are the instructions that can be carried out by the ALU, or instructions that can be executed by the ALU? As we have seen, the ALU will consist of the integer unit and the floating point unit, and these units can perform the basic arithmetic operations like the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And all these operations require two operands, which are called the source operands, and then the arithmetic unit will perform the specified operation on these source operands and then generate the result, and that result can be put in the destination operand. So typically, the machine level instruction will have the format like the operation to be carried out, then the source operand 1 and the source operand 2, and then the destination operand values. So there will be 3 operands for each of the instructions typically, right? And the typical format of this machine level instruction is the operation to be carried out, the destination operand of the instruction, then the source operand of the first source operand of the instruction, and the second source operand of the instruction. Okay, so let's say in a simple case, let's say if I have an instruction like, or a statement like z equal to x plus y, right? I can have an instruction like add. What are the source operands here? X and y, right? And what is the destination operand here? It is z, right? So the machine level instruction may look like this, right? Saying that I want to perform the add operation on the source operands x and y and put the result in the destination operand z, right? Now we are going to address on how to address the issue of how to represent the information associated with the instruction. How do we represent this instruction? What do you mean by representation? What do you mean by representing this instruction? Basically, the instruction also has to be stored as sequence of bits, right? And so we need some number of bits for specifying the operation. That's what is called as the operation code, or simply called as the opcode. Then how do we specify the operands here? What we require is actually the values of these operands that can be given as input to the ALU, that is the values of the source operands, and the ALU will generate the result, and that result has to be put in the variable z. But where are the variables available to us? All these variables will have some memory addresses associated with them, right? So the operand x will have some memory address, and y will have another memory address, and z will have another memory address. And what is the typical size of this memory address? We have seen that the typical size of the memory unit is 2 power k by 32 bits, where k will be very large. So we are talking about in the current day process where k is possibly 30, right? So each of these memory addresses will be at least 30-bit address, right? So how many bits are required to represent this instruction? I require 30 bits to specify the address of x, 30 bits for the address of y, and 30 bits for the address of z. So that takes 90 bits. And maybe let's say the opcode is maybe 6 bits, right? So that requires 96 bits. So each instruction then requires a 96-bit representation if I have to represent this instruction in this form, right? And where do I store this instruction? Instruction also has to be stored in the memory. So this instruction will have one memory address, but how many bits can be stored typically in the memory address? Typically, we are talking about 32-bit wide memories, right? So only 32 bits of this instruction can be stored in one memory location. So then we require 3 memory locations to be accessed to fetch this instruction or to get the complete information from the about the instruction. What does that mean? in order to execute one instruction, I have to fetch the 96 bits from the memory, which means that I have to fetch the contents of 3 memory locations, which means that I need to perform 3 memory read operations. Then only my instruction information can be obtained. After I get the instruction information, then we have to perform the operation and then carry out the execution of the instruction. Right? But this is a very complex representation, okay, where every instruction takes of the size of 3 words, or where each word is of 32 bits, right? So this is not feasible, all right? So we need a simpler format of the instructions, where typically each of these instructions can be stored in only one word if possible, right? Or maximum of 2 words, okay? So depending on the format of these instructions, there are 2, I'll quickly close, right? There are 2 different types of what are called the processor architectures. One is what is called the complex instruction set computer architecture, which is shortly referred to as the CIS architecture, complex instruction set computer architecture. And the other one is what is called the reduced instruction set computer architecture, which is shortly referred to as the RISC architecture. So what we'll do in tomorrow's class is look at some details of this CISC architecture and the RISC architecture, and then see how any given higher level language program statement can be converted into a sequence of instructions corresponding to each of these architectures, so that we get some idea about how the instructions get represented for a given program. Okay, maybe I'll stop at this point. Are there any questions? Okay, there are no questions. I think we'll stop here. We'll see you at 9 o'clock tomorrow.